When I looked at Adventures in Poor Taste this Monday, they had an interview with Vita Ayala. I was very excited. I was ecstatic. Now, when I read it, I was a little bit less ecstatic. It was kind of mundane, not a whole lot of information in there. But if you really look between the lines, Vita Ayala is giving out a lot of information and really spotlighting a lot of the reasons that X-Men isn't working right now, specifically with her writing. About a week ago, Doc and I reviewed New Mutants 25. We said it was the best work of Vita Ayala's career. But one of the major criticisms that we had is that none of the characters really had their own voice. They kind of all sounded the same. And then specifically, Magic could not verbalize to Danny Moonstar and Wolfsbane why she was going with their plan. Danny Moonstar and Wolfsbane were presenting valid reasons why she shouldn't do what she did, but she could never explain it. And I kind of figured out why during this interview. This was the question from AIPT. Something that makes the first part of the labors of Magic so compelling are the main characters' unique points of view. As a writer, how do you balance making compelling character arguments without making your personal preferences too apparent to the readers? This is what Vita Ayala had to say. It's a pickle, and one that Rod and I want to be as fair about as we can. I try to put myself into each position as if it were my own, because I think that is the only way to even approach doing them justice. Did you hear that? I try to put myself into each position as if it were my own. And that also explains why all the characters have the exact same voice. She's not thinking about these characters as unique individuals with their own sets of history and life experiences and own points of view. She's only thinking about them as a vessel for her own point of view. And that's one of the reasons Vita Ayala fails time and time again in comic books. Because as she says, I try hard to put myself into each position as if it were my own. Because I think that is the only way to even approach doing them justice. Because her own point of view and her own position on these ideas is the only thing that even is worthy of justice, right? What Magic thinks about the situation isn't important. What Wolfsbane thinks about the situation isn't important. What Danny Moonstar thinks about the situation isn't important if those points of view don't align directly with Vita Ayala. And that's one of the reasons that her stories don't work. Her characters aren't compelling because she's telling the story as if she were the characters in the story. They don't have their own unique voices. They don't have their own points of view. And it's clear from what Vita Ayala said in this interview, there's a reason why. Because she's writing each line of dialogue as if it was coming from herself and not from the characters themselves. That's a huge issue. But that's not the only thing she expanded upon. AIPT asked if we're going to actually see Tran in New Mutants at some point, as well as follow-up on Reign's story with Tyr. Vita says, I imagine so, though I would not be able to say when or even where. One of the really fun things about the X line, for me anyway, is that we are kind of a microcosm of how the larger Marvel universe works. Each team has stories they are telling, but we are also actively engaged in being additive so that other teams have more resources to reach from. We pool ideas for characters and story, and if some end up working in other places, we send them off to where they need to be. The room is a gift. I don't think there's another answer in this interview that's more enlightening than when Vita Ayala says the X line is like a microcosm of Marvel Comics itself. There's a reason there aren't a lot of good Marvel comics coming out. There are good pockets here and there depending on some creators. And then she talks about how these creators that are in the X-Men office and the XMen Slack, so that would be a Vita Ayala, a Tini Howard, a Leah Williams, Ben Percy, Jerry Duggan. Now we've got Kieran Gillen, Al Ewing, and a few others. They're pooling ideas. You've only got maybe one or two good comic book writers there, and then you have a bunch of people that need a lot of assistance. And it makes sense when you read the X-Men comic books these days and why they're such a mess, is you have bad creators passing bad ideas around to each other, and they're just making them worse. That's why nothing ever gets better. Nothing gets more coherent over time as to what story they're trying to tell. You literally have a room of people led by Jordan White where the blind are leading the blind. Do you think an original idea from Leah Williams handed off to Vita Ayala will ever get better or will end up being successful? Do you think an original idea from Ben Percy going over to Tini Howard is a good recipe for success? They need to clamp down on this. There's a reason all the ideas in the X-Men office, for the most part, are really shitty and they don't resonate with people because you have a bunch of talentless hacks essentially trading ideas with each other and making each other worse writers. No one's gotten better. If anything, I would say Ben Percy has become a much worse writer in the X-Men office. Now it makes sense because he's probably working with some of the stupid ideas that he's been encouraged to work with from a Tinny Howard, from a Leah Williams, from a Vita Ayala, from a Jerry Duggan, probably by Jordan White himself. It will never get better until you have good, responsible leadership with oversight on these dumb ideas and erasing them from the idea board and only letting the best ideas go forward. But it's clear there's just this hodgepodge of dumb ideas being passed around as the X-Men line of comic books just get worse and worse. I wonder how that's happening. Next up, AIPT asks what the process was like giving Karma her first girlfriend and how it's been getting the chance to write a side of Zion we've rarely seen before. This is Vita's answer. It's been a gift, honestly. It was important to me to both allow her space to be young and have feelings in a way that wasn't plot related. Thanks to Angelique Roque and Sarah Brunstad for that spot in the 2021 Pride issue, and also make sure that the relationship was integrated into the main line as naturally as I could. I didn't want superhero plot drama or angst to be entangled in what Zion and Elle are to each other. Karma deserves the regular kind of does she, doesn't she relationship angst. Obviously, it has been a high priority for Marvel Comics to integrate more LGBTQ relationships within Marvel Comics, but they haven't really done it very well. And you can see here why when Vita explains how she was putting this relationship with Karma and Zion into New Mutants. She didn't want the relationship itself to be plot related. So while you're reading the story and you're reading the plot and then, the story's going along, and all of a sudden it flashes to this relationship and it has nothing to do with the plot. And you're like, why the fuck am I reading this? This has nothing to do with anything. This is filler. This shouldn't be here. And it makes sense why. She doesn't want to bog down their relationship with the actual plot of the story that the comic book is telling. People aren't buying New Mutants for this Karma-Zion relationship. They're buying it for the story. The plot needs to be the front and center focused thing. Shockingly, Vita Ayala, whose only identity is their race and their sexuality, can only think about the relationship between these two characters and what it means to her. So therefore it becomes front and center. The plot becomes secondary and the story falls apart. The interest in the comic book falls apart. She doesn't know how to integrate relationships into the plot. She doesn't realize how important plot angst is to comic book relationships. Can you imagine if when you read Amazing Spider-Man, the relationship between Mary Jane and Peter Parker or the relationship between Gwen Stacy and Peter Parker was never plot related? That's what makes the relationship interesting and why it has a place within the story to begin with. Because if it wasn't, Stan Lee would have thrown it out because it wouldn't have been important to the story. Jerry Conway would have thrown it out because it wasn't important to the story. That's what happens when you bring in these unseasoned creators that don't understand the importance of tying everything together. You can have relationship moments, but it has to be in service of the plot itself. Now, if you've been writing a relationship for 5 years and people are really invested in it, you could have an entire comic book about the relationship because the customers like the relationship. They're invested in it. It's part of the plot at that point. But when you're in the beginning stages and you're just throwing it in there and you're making it more important than the actual story itself, see also Superman Son of Kal, it doesn't work. It all falls apart and the heroes don't feel like heroes anymore. And it's clear that I'm reading something that's intended for 13-year-old girls, not for actual superhero readers. This is not strictly a Vita Ayala problem. I already talked about Tom Taylor's Superman Son of Kal-El, but this is an issue throughout comic books. There's a reason a lot of these relationships are off-putting. It's not because they're LGBTQ representative. It's because they're not being integrated into the plot and they feel like filler and it doesn't actually belong in the comic book. And you can see why after listening to Vita Ayala explain it. Now, this last thing, I don't know why she even broached this subject. Well, I guess it was a question, but this makes me not very happy. Are there any plans for any children of the Atom to show up in New Mutants or elsewhere? And this is what Vita Ayala had to say. It is my deep and sincere hope to be able to revisit some, if not all, of the Children of the Atom kids sooner rather than later. I can't make promises because nothing is certain until it is past, but I will be open and honest here and say that I plan very much to do so. This is another failing of a lot of comic book creators these days. You come up with an idea and you're emotionally attached to the character. see Steve Orlando and Somnus. That is essentially Steve Orlando in the comic book. Somnus is a lame-ass character. He doesn't belong anywhere in any of the X-Men titles, but he's got to be a major player in Steve Orlando's new Marauders series. And it turns people off. He's not a fleshed-out character. He was never made to be cool because Steve Orlando's not cool. But Steve Orlando is emotionally attached to Somnus, so he has to be in there. The same thing is happening with Vita Ayala and Children of the Atom. There's reasons that Vita Ayala is personally invested in those characters, and I'm not going to go into those because that would be another 20 minutes. But sometimes you just have to let go of a bad idea. If something wasn't successful and Children of the Atom was not successful, that was storytelling at its worst. You just got to let's cut bait. Let's concentrate on the characters that we do have that are working and see if we can do the best job that we can. Hey, and maybe in 5 or 10 years when people forget about how bad Children of the Atom is, maybe we can revisit the characters. But you know that she wants to include those characters because they're original characters, and she likely sees a lot of herself in a lot of the Children of the Atom, which kind of makes sense that the Children of the Atom are so boring and didn't really seem to have very much identity outside of their race and sexual preference and stuff like that, because that's how Vita Ayala thinks. And unfortunately, that's how she writes. It's time to get rid of Children of the Atom. It's a lost cause. There's no reason to revisit that. Concentrate on what you can do well, what people actually like, and move on, because Somnus, Forget-Me-Not, the Children of the Atom, all terrible ideas that X-Men creators are ham-fisting into the X-Men universe, and none of them are working. Some of you may ask, how the hell did we get here? Who could actually be in charge to let somebody this incompetent write major stories for the X-Men? That would be Jordan D. White, group editor of the X-Men themselves. And in this video, I talk about how he's really overseeing the destruction of the X-Men line. Nobody's getting better. They're only getting worse because he's a terrible leader. We're not getting better X-Men until Jordan White leaves.